Thomas Alden had always been the kind of person people noticed, even when he said nothing at all. There was something about the way he held himself, straight, steady, almost perfectly still, that made others stop and stare. Most people knew him only as one of the royal guards, the ones who stood outside the palace gates every day. But even among those guards, Thomas was known for being unusually disciplined. New recruits often whispered about him, wondering how anyone could stay so focused for so many hours without blinking or flinching. Older guards who had worked beside him for years simply shook their heads and said, "That's Thomas. Nothing breaks his attention." Every morning, long before tourists arrived, Thomas would report for duty with the same calm and quiet routine. He polished his shoes until they looked like mirrors, adjusted his uniform so it sat perfectly straight, and checked every detail twice. He believed that anything worth doing should be done with full commitment, and guarding the palace was more than a job to him. It was a promise. His father had once worked in the same service, and Thomas grew up hearing stories about responsibility, honor, and the meaning of standing strong for others. Those stories shaped him deeply, even if he rarely spoke about them. When Thomas took his place at the main gate, he became almost like part of the structure. Visitors often said he looked like a statue, frozen in time except for the movement of his chest as he breathed. Some people thought he took his job too seriously, but most respected him for it. After all, there was something comforting about seeing someone so dependable, someone who never lost focus no matter how noisy or crowded the area became. Tourists loved to gather around the guards, especially during the busy summer months. Families from all over the world came to take pictures, laugh, and sometimes try to make the guards smile, something Thomas never did while on duty. Children waved at him, teenagers whispered jokes to each other, and adults pointed at his tall hat or perfect posture. Thomas heard it all, but he stayed still, just as he was trained to do. It wasn't that he disliked the visitors. In fact, he often found their excitement charming. But during his duty hours, he viewed himself as someone representing the highest level of respect and discipline. Smiling or reacting wasn't part of the role, so he chose to leave those moments for after work. Many guards eventually learned to let small distractions slide off their shoulders like raindrops. Thomas was especially good at this. When someone stepped too close, he stayed calm. When a loud group cheered suddenly, he didn't even blink. When a camera flash went off directly in front of him, he kept his eyes forward. His ability to stay composed became something of a legend among tourists. People would tell their friends, "Go see the guard who doesn't move at all. He's amazing." Some even returned a second time just to test him again. Despite all the attention, Thomas never let himself become proud or overly confident. He believed that discipline should be steady and humble, not loud or showy. His quiet nature made him seem distant to some of the other guards, but in truth, he simply wasn't used to speaking without purpose. When he did talk, his words were thoughtful and gentle. His calm personality made younger guards feel comfortable asking for advice, and he helped them patiently, guiding them through their training without ever raising his voice. Yet even though he was respected, few people truly knew him well. Thomas kept his personal life private, not because he wanted to be mysterious, but because he had always been that way. Even as a child, he preferred listening to others rather than talking about himself. He had grown up in a small town where everyone knew each other, and his quiet nature made him something of an observer. He learned early on how much he could understand about someone just by watching them, noticing their expressions, the way they moved, or how they reacted in different situations. This habit stayed with him into adulthood, and although it made him an excellent guard, it also made him seem a bit hard to approach. Still, there was a softness in Thomas that most people missed. It only appeared in small, rare moments, like when a child waved enthusiastically at him and he allowed himself the tiniest flicker of warmth in his heart, or when an elderly couple walked by holding hands, and he found himself quietly admiring their lifelong bond. He thought about kindness more often than people realized. To Thomas, kindness was a quiet strength, something that didn't need to be announced or displayed. He believed that true kindness came from simple, sincere actions, not big gestures or dramatic moments. Thomas often reminded himself that behind every visitor was a personal story. Some were seeing the palace for the first time. Some were celebrating birthdays or anniversaries. Others were simply exploring a new country. He felt honored, in a way, to be part of their memories, even if they would never learn his name. He even kept a mental picture of the most memorable visitors he had seen over the years: the little boy who tried to salute him with a toy sword, the shy teenager who practiced her English by thanking him for his service, the older gentleman who bowed politely before taking a photo. These small interactions warmed him inside, even if he could not respond to them. His dedication sometimes puzzled his fellow guards. They often joked lightly with each other before and after shifts, sharing stories or discussing weekend plans. Thomas joined in politely when he could, but he rarely shared stories of his own. Instead, he listened with genuine interest, letting them talk about their families, hobbies, or funny things they saw during their shift. He cared about them, even if he expressed it quietly. His peaceful nature made him someone others trusted without fully realizing why. Yet despite all of this, Thomas's reputation remained one of seriousness. Tourists who didn't know him might assume he was strict, cold, or uninterested in the world around him. They couldn't have been more mistaken. Thomas simply believed that when you are responsible for something important, you give it your full heart. And that was how he viewed his job, an important promise he intended to keep every day. As the summer season began and the palace grounds grew even more crowded, Thomas prepared himself for another long day of standing watch. He knew what to expect: excited children, curious visitors, flashing cameras, and endless chatter. He also knew that he would handle it the way he always did, with calmness and quiet strength. But he could never have predicted that this particular day would be different, that something unexpected would happen, something that would test his discipline in a way he had never experienced before. What Thomas didn't know was that before the afternoon ended, a single small moment would reveal a side of him very few people had ever seen, and that moment would change the way the world viewed him forever. The day began like any other, warm and bright, with sunlight resting gently on the palace walls. The sky was clear, the air carried a soft summer breeze, and a long line of visitors had already gathered near the gates. It was one of those days when people seemed extra excited, children tugging at their parents' hands, teenagers taking photos of everything they saw, and families walking with wide smiles as they admired the historical beauty around them. Tour groups spoke in many languages, all mixing into a cheerful sound that filled the area. Street musicians played soft tunes in the distance, adding to the pleasant atmosphere. The colorful dresses, hats, souvenirs, and bright sunshine made the whole place feel like a lively festival. Thomas Alden stood in his usual place, perfectly still, his uniform neat and his posture strong. He had done this countless times, watching the crowd while appearing as if he saw nothing at all. But in truth, he saw everything. He noticed the excited faces, the curious eyes, the happy families, and the peaceful way people enjoyed their visit. Though he never reacted, he quietly appreciated the simple joy around him. Every so often, a little child would wave at him, hoping he would wave back. Thomas didn't move, but he always felt a small warmth bloom in his chest when it happened. Some visitors tried to make him smile by acting funny or posing dramatically in front of him. He never broke form, though he sometimes found their playful attempts quite charming. For hours, everything went smoothly. People passed by, took photos, and admired the royal guards. The afternoon sun made the palace walls look almost golden, and the gentle wind kept the heat from becoming too strong. It was the kind of day guards usually didn't mind, since the weather was comfortable and the crowd stayed calm. But then, as Thomas scanned the area with quiet attention, he noticed a shift in the crowd. A small cluster of visitors seemed unsure of where to go, walking back and forth while looking around. At first, it didn't seem unusual. Tourists often got confused about directions. But something else caught his eye. A tiny figure standing alone near the side of the gate. It was a little girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, with soft brown hair and a pink dress. She held a small stuffed animal in her hands, pressing it tightly against her chest. Her eyes were big, filled with uncertainty, and her lips trembled as if she were trying not to cry. Thomas sensed immediately that she was upset. He saw the way she turned her head quickly from side to side, searching the crowd. Each time she didn't find what she was looking for, her tiny shoulders dropped a little more. She wasn't screaming or causing a scene. She stood quietly, almost frozen, the same way Thomas stood during his duty. But her stillness came from fear, not discipline. Tourists walked past her without noticing much. Everyone was busy taking pictures, adjusting their maps, checking their phones, or chatting with their families. No one realized the little girl was alone. And because she wasn't calling out or running around, it was easy for strangers to overlook her. Thomas, however, was trained to observe details. Even the smallest change in the environment never escaped his attention. The moment he saw the child, he knew something wasn't right. His instincts told him she had become separated from her family. It wasn't unusual for children to wander off a few steps while their parents looked around, but there was something different about this girl. She stood very still, as if she didn't know what to do. There was a quiet sadness in her expression, and her eyes kept filling with tears she refused to let fall. Her stuffed animal, a soft little rabbit, seemed to be the only thing giving her comfort in that moment. Thomas watched her closely while maintaining his stillness. His role required him to stay in position, unless there was a genuine need to act. He knew he couldn't move unless the situation truly demanded it. Yet he also knew the importance of noticing when someone was quietly in distress. A few minutes passed, and the girl continued standing there, looking lost and frightened. She took a small step forward, then stopped again, unsure of where to go. She pressed the stuffed rabbit even closer to her chest, as if she were asking it for courage. Her small face grew red as she tried to hold back tears. Nearby, a group of adults, likely her parents, were moving quickly through the crowd, looking around frantically. They seemed worried, checking every direction, calling out words Thomas couldn't hear through the noise. But they were too far away from the girl, and they hadn't yet spotted her. Thomas realized they were searching for someone, and he felt a heavy certainty that it was the little girl. But they were facing the wrong direction, and the crowd kept shifting around them, blocking their view. The distance between them seemed small, but in a place so crowded, even a few steps could feel like a long journey for a lost child. Thomas wanted to help. Every part of him wished he could simply kneel down, walk over to her, or signal to someone. But he was a guard on duty. He stood at his post, bound by strict expectations. Moving without reason wasn't allowed. His duty required him to remain still. Yet as he watched the girl wipe her eyes with the back of her hand and glance hopelessly at the endless wave of strangers walking past, something stirred inside him. The sight felt strangely familiar, as if it touched something from deep within his memory, something from his own childhood, something he didn't often revisit. The girl's smallness, her silence, the way she hugged her stuffed toy, it all pulled at a very human part of him that went beyond rules and training. It wasn't dramatic or noisy distress. It was quiet distress, the kind that easily went unnoticed. And that was exactly why Thomas felt compelled to keep his eyes on her. Minutes continued to pass. The crowd grew even larger, and soon she was surrounded by legs, bags, and unfamiliar faces. Every time someone walked too close, the girl flinched and took a step back, as if she felt smaller and smaller in the bustling sea of people. She looked like she wanted to call out but was too afraid or too shy to do so. No one around her seemed to realize what she was going through. Most people were focused on their own visit, their photos, their excitement. And in all that noise, this tiny child's quiet fear went unnoticed, except by Thomas. He watched her glance toward him. For a moment, their eyes met. It was brief, gentle, and filled with uncertainty. She didn't understand who he was or what his role meant. But something about his stillness seemed to catch her attention. Maybe she saw safety in the way he didn't move. Maybe she simply felt drawn toward the only calm figure in the chaos around her. Whatever it was, that single moment of eye contact felt important to Thomas. He saw the question in her eyes, the silent plea for help that she was too afraid to voice. And he also saw the growing worry on the faces of the adults far away, who had clearly realized their child wasn't beside them anymore. Thomas stood motionless, but inside, a quiet tension began building. He had always taken pride in following the rules perfectly, never stepping out of line. But this time, the weight of the rules seemed heavier than usual. It wasn't because he disliked them. It was because, for the first time, he felt that someone needed him in a way that the rules didn't fully address. The situation was delicate. The girl wasn't in danger, but she was scared. Her parents weren't far, but they couldn't see her. And Thomas was the only person who had noticed both sides of the problem. A simple moment, a small child, a crowded place. Yet somehow, everything felt more meaningful than usual. And in the quiet space between duty and compassion, Thomas felt himself slowly reaching a decision inside his heart, one that he had never expected to face. The day that had begun like any other was about to turn into something memorable, something different from anything Thomas had ever experienced during his years of service. And as the sun continued shining over the palace walls, Thomas realized that sometimes even the calmest days can take an unexpected turn. The moment felt heavier than any Thomas had experienced in years of service. He stood still, just as he had been trained, but inside him something had shifted. His eyes followed the little girl who still clutched her stuffed rabbit tightly, her small fingers wrapped around it as if it were the only thing she could trust. She looked around again, her face filled with quiet sadness and fear. She wasn't loud, she wasn't drawing attention. She simply looked lost. Thomas knew he couldn't ignore her any longer. For a long second, he reminded himself of every rule he had ever followed. The rules were clear. Guards were to remain still unless there was a clear reason to act. They were symbols of strength, tradition, and discipline. Moving without instruction wasn't just frowned upon, it was considered unprofessional. Visitors often tried to make the guards smile or react because they knew how strict the rules were, and Thomas was famous for never reacting. He had built a reputation for perfect discipline, the kind of guard who could stand for hours without blinking or shifting. But now, something inside him felt different. His heart felt heavier, warmer, almost urgent. He wasn't reacting to laughter, jokes, or playful tourists. This was something entirely different. This was a child, a small, frightened child who didn't know where her parents were. Thomas took a slow breath, steadying his mind. He wasn't impulsive by nature. He always thought before acting. But sometimes he knew the right thing wasn't written in rules. It was written in the moment. The girl lifted her face again. This time she looked directly at him, her eyes full of confusion and hope at the same time. She didn't say a word, but she didn't need to. Thomas could see everything in her expression. "Please help me. I don't know what to do." Something gentle inside him responded, not in words, not in movement yet, but in a feeling that settled deep in his chest. It reminded him of a time long ago, when he himself had been small and scared. He remembered how overwhelming it felt to be surrounded by strangers. He remembered wishing for someone calm to guide him. That memory pulled him forward in a way nothing else could. The crowd around Thomas continued moving, laughing, taking pictures, unaware of the quiet struggle happening between a royal guard and a lost child. But Thomas couldn't forget the look in her eyes. It felt like she was silently calling to him. Then, without giving himself another moment to hesitate, Thomas slowly, carefully broke the one rule he had never broken before. He stepped forward. It was a small movement, just one step, but to the people watching it was unbelievable. Some tourists gasped softly. Others paused mid-photo, lowering their cameras as if they couldn't trust what they had just seen. Royal guards didn't move unless it was necessary, and seeing one take a step was like watching a statue suddenly come to life. Thomas didn't look at anyone else. His eyes stayed on the girl. His face remained calm, as steady and controlled as ever, but there was something new in his posture, a gentle purpose, a quiet intention. He took another step, still slow, still controlled. The little girl stiffened at first. Surprised that the guard she had been staring at was now moving toward her, her eyes widened. But when she saw the softness in his expression and the care in his movements, her shoulders relaxed slightly. Thomas lowered himself carefully onto one knee. It was a graceful motion, not rushed or dramatic. It was the kind of movement only someone deeply disciplined could make quietly. The crowd grew even more silent as they watched him. Cameras lifted. People whispered. Some simply stared in awe. Thomas didn't speak. Guards rarely spoke unless necessary, and he didn't want to frighten the girl with loud authority. Instead, he tapped the ground gently near her foot. Tap. Tap. The sound was soft, like a polite request for attention. The girl looked at him curiously. Her stuffed rabbit dangled from her arm as she watched his gentle gesture. Thomas then pointed in her direction, placing his gloved hand over his heart for a brief second, hoping she would understand that he meant no harm. Then he extended his hand slightly, palm open, inviting her to step closer. For a moment, the little girl hesitated, not because she was afraid of him, but because everything around her felt unfamiliar. The noise, the crowd, the towering palace walls, everything felt too big for her small world. Yet something about Thomas seemed safe. His calmness, his stillness, his gentle gesture, it all felt like a quiet promise that she wasn't alone. Slowly, almost timidly, she stepped closer to him. Just one tiny step. Her eyes stayed on him the whole time. Her breathing quickened with emotion she couldn't describe, but she didn't step back. Thomas nodded softly, offering a comforting presence without breaking the silence. With another careful movement, he lifted his arm and gestured toward the far end of the crowd where her parents were still searching, unaware that their child was so close. The girl followed the direction of his gesture, turning her head. But she was too short to see over the mass of people. She looked back at Thomas with confusion. Thomas wanted to stand up and guide her, but he couldn't walk away from his post completely. Instead, he did something simple but meaningful. He shifted slightly, just enough to catch the attention of another nearby guard who had also started noticing the situation. The other guard's eyes widened slightly in surprise, but immediately understood. He quickly signaled to a nearby staff member who assisted with tourism. Within seconds, the staff member began searching the crowd in the direction Thomas indicated. The little girl watched everything quietly, still clutching her stuffed rabbit. She didn't speak, but she stayed close to Thomas now, trusting the calm figure kneeling beside her. Tourists around them continued capturing the moment. Some whispered things like, "I've never seen a guard move like that," or, "He must have a heart of gold." But Thomas didn't pay attention to any of them. His focus remained solely on the child. A few moments later, a woman's voice, filled with worry and relief, rose above the crowd. The girl's head snapped up. She recognized it immediately. It was her mother. Thomas gently pointed again, this time more clearly. The girl followed his gesture, and when she saw her mother pushing through the crowd with wide, tear-filled eyes, she rushed forward without hesitation. Thomas watched as the girl ran into her mother's arms. The reunion was tender and emotional, filled with hugs and relieved smiles. Her father joined moments later, embracing them both, his face full of gratitude. The girl pointed back toward Thomas, telling them in her own small way who had helped her. The parents looked in Thomas's direction. Their faces softened with appreciation, and though they couldn't approach him directly, they offered him a deep, heartfelt nod. Thomas returned a tiny, respectful nod, small enough to stay within his limits but meaningful enough for them to see. Once the girl was safely with her family, Thomas stood up slowly and returned to his post. His posture straightened, his expression settled back into serene discipline, and he resumed his stillness as if nothing unusual had happened. But something had happened. Something that changed how people looked at him. Something that would soon be seen by millions of people around the world. For now, though, Thomas simply stood there, calm and composed, grateful that a small act of kindness had helped a child find her family again. And even though he returned to stillness, his heart felt lighter than it had all day. When Thomas returned to his position, it felt as though the world around him had shifted. He stood tall again, still and silent, but the atmosphere near the gate no longer felt the same. Something warm lingered in the air, as if the kindness from a few minutes earlier had quietly spread through the crowd. People whispered softly as they walked by. Some looked at Thomas with admiration, others with surprise, and many with grateful smiles, even if they didn't fully understand what had happened. They only knew they had witnessed something rare, something gentle, something that touched their hearts in a quiet but powerful way. For Thomas, however, everything felt both familiar and unfamiliar at once. His posture was the same. His uniform was perfect. His eyes were forward. But inside, he felt slightly different. Helping that little girl had stirred something deep within him. It reminded him that behind every duty, behind every uniform, there was still a human heart. He didn't regret moving. He didn't regret stepping out of formation. In fact, he felt peaceful. He knew he had done something meaningful, something right, even if it wasn't written in the official rules. As the minutes passed, more visitors stopped to take photos. This time not because they wanted to tease the guard or test his seriousness, but because they felt inspired. Thomas didn't react, of course, but he noticed how gentle their expressions were. He saw families smiling at him with respect. He saw children pointing and whispering to their parents about the nice guard. He saw even the other guards giving him small glances of quiet approval, though none of them spoke a word. Still, Thomas continued his duty as he always did, believing the moment would quietly fade away as the day went on. But he was wrong, very wrong. Unbeknown to him, several tourists had recorded the entire moment on their phones. The sight of a royal guard kneeling gently to help a lost child was something unusual, something touching, something people naturally wanted to share. As soon as they left the palace grounds, visitors began uploading the videos online. They wrote captions like, "I witnessed something beautiful today. Not all heroes wear capes, some wear royal uniforms. This guard's kindness melted my heart." The videos spread quickly across social media. At first, only a few hundred people watched them. But then, within an hour, thousands more started sharing the clips. By evening, millions had seen the calm, respectful way Thomas had helped the little girl. People watched the moment when he stepped forward. They watched the way he knelt down so gently. They watched the little girl step toward him, trusting him without hesitation. They watched him guide her silently with kind gestures. And they watched the reunion between the child and her parents. made possible by the guard who chose compassion over strict rules. Comments flooded in from all over the world. This brought tears to my eyes. What a beautiful act of kindness. He didn't need words to help her. His actions spoke louder. I wish more people were like him. He kept his dignity and showed his heart. Amazing. By the next morning, the video had reached news channels. Reporters talked about the mysterious guard who broke character for a little girl. They didn't know his name yet, but they called him the Kind Royal Guard or the Gentle Guardian. Some magazines wrote articles about the importance of kindness, using Thomas's moment as an example. Others created drawings and illustrations of the moment, admiring the simple beauty of it. The palace staff, who normally stayed quiet about such things, also received an unusual number of messages from the public. People wrote letters, sent emails, and made calls just to express how touched they were. One message said, "Please let the guard know that his small act of kindness meant the world to us." Another read, "In a time when people rush too much, it's wonderful to see someone stop and care." A teacher even wrote, "I showed the video to my students to teach them about empathy." Meanwhile, Thomas remained unaware of all this attention. When he woke up the next morning and put on his uniform, he had no idea that people everywhere were talking about him. He didn't know that his face had become a symbol of quiet kindness. He had simply done what felt right, and in his mind, the moment had already passed, but the palace staff had noticed. They recognized Thomas in the videos instantly. At first, they were surprised. After all, Thomas was known for his exceptional discipline, but when they reviewed the incident carefully, they understood that he hadn't acted recklessly. He had acted responsibly and gently, ensuring the child received help without creating panic or breaking the dignity of his role. Later that day, when Thomas arrived at his new shift, several co-workers gave him small, knowing smiles. One of them whispered, "You're famous, Thomas." Another chuckled softly, "I didn't know you had that in you." Thomas blinked, confused. "Famous?" he asked quietly, though he rarely spoke while in uniform. "You helped a little girl yesterday," one guard said. "It's everywhere." Thomas didn't know what to say. He hadn't expected attention. He certainly hadn't wanted fame. For him, it had been a simple act, something any kind person would have done. But the world saw it differently. They saw it as a reminder that kindness still existed in unexpected places. They saw it as hope. A few hours into his shift, a small crowd gathered again at the gates. Many people held their phones up, not to tease him, but to share smiles, take respectful photos, or wave politely. Some children waved their stuffed toys at him, copying the girl in the video. Others simply stood quietly, admiring him. A few tourists whispered, "That's him, the kind guard." Thomas felt slightly overwhelmed, though he didn't show it. He remained still, performing his duty with the same calmness as always. But inside, he felt a gentle mixture of humility and warmth. He never expected that a single kind gesture could reach so many hearts. Later that afternoon, something unexpected happened. The little girl he had helped returned with her parents. She wore the same pink dress, but this time her face was bright, hopeful, and full of excitement instead of fear. Her parents stood nearby, grateful and emotional. They wanted to thank him again, but they knew the rules about approaching guards, so they simply stood back respectfully. The little girl, however, stepped forward. She didn't touch him. She only held up her stuffed rabbit and gave him the sweetest smile, a smile filled with trust and appreciation. Thomas didn't move, but he felt a warmth spread through him. Even without speaking, the moment felt complete in a quiet, meaningful way. Hours later, when Thomas finished his shift and walked back inside the palace, he finally asked one of the staff members, "Is what I did yesterday causing a problem?" The staff member smiled kindly. "Not at all. In fact, people are calling you an example of calm kindness. The palace has received many messages thanking you." Thomas was relieved. He didn't want to cause trouble. He didn't want attention either, but knowing that people saw the kindness behind his action made him happy in a peaceful, quiet way. That night, as he walked home through the softly lit streets, he thought about everything that had happened. He thought about the girl, her parents, the crowd, the whispers, and the videos he hadn't even seen yet. He never planned to become an example. He simply listened to his heart in a small moment that needed a gentle response. And that small moment had touched the world. Thomas realized something important. Sometimes the most meaningful acts are not big or loud. They are small, simple, and done quietly, but they leave warm marks on the hearts of many. He didn't need recognition. He didn't need praise. Knowing the little girl was safe was enough, but the world continued to celebrate him anyway. Even though the world was now talking about him, Thomas still woke up the next morning in the same quiet way he always did. His life had never been about fame. He was a man of routine, calm mornings, a simple breakfast, a quiet walk to the palace, and a steady dedication to his duty. But this morning, something inside him felt different. Not in a loud or dramatic way, but in a soft, warm way, like a small light glowing gently in his chest. When Thomas stepped outside his home, he noticed something unusual. A few neighbors who usually only gave polite nods now smiled more warmly. One elderly woman who lived down the street paused her morning walk and said, "I saw you on the news yesterday. That was a beautiful thing you did." Thomas wasn't used to compliments. His face colored lightly, but he remained polite and humble. "I simply did what anyone would do," he replied quietly. But the woman shook her head with a kind smile. "Not everyone would. Kindness is special, Thomas. Never forget that." As he continued walking, he realized she might be right. Not everyone noticed the quiet, small moments where kindness was needed. Not everyone stepped forward when they could have stayed still. And though he had not acted for attention, it made him feel grateful to know people saw it for what it truly was, a moment of simple humanity. When Thomas arrived at the palace, the atmosphere felt different again. The guards who usually greeted each other with quick nods looked at him with quiet admiration. One of the senior guards approached him privately and said, "Well done, Thomas. You made us proud." Thomas bowed his head slightly, not wanting to seem overly emotional. "I was just trying to help," he answered. The senior guard smiled gently. Sometimes the smallest actions speak louder than the biggest speeches. Throughout the morning, more visitors gathered at the gates, far more than usual. Many of them weren't there just for the palace. They were hoping to catch a glimpse of the guard who had touched their hearts. Some visitors carried small signs that simply said, "Thank you." Others held drawings made by children showing a tall guard kneeling beside a little girl. Some brought flowers, which palace staff later collected and placed neatly by the entrance. Thomas didn't react, of course. His role demanded composure. But inside, he was humbled. It felt strange to become a symbol of kindness when he had only followed his heart in a moment of need. Still, he understood why people were moved. The world, he knew, often rushed. People hurried to work, hurried through their days, hurried through life. Moments like this reminded them to slow down and care. Around midday, a palace official approached him during a scheduled break. The official smiled warmly and said, "Thomas, we've spoken with the higher staff. They want to personally thank you for your gentle actions. They say you represented the palace with dignity and heart." Thomas wasn't sure how to react to such praise. He had never been someone who sought attention, but hearing that he had brought pride to his role meant more to him than he could express. Later, when he returned to his position at the gate, something unexpected happened. A small, familiar figure approached with careful steps, guided by her parents. It was the little girl, the same one he had helped. She wore a soft yellow dress that fluttered gently in the breeze, and her stuffed rabbit was held lovingly in her hands. She looked healthier now, brighter, full of confidence instead of fear. Her parents stood a few steps behind, allowing her to approach while giving Thomas a respectful distance. The little girl didn't speak, but she didn't need to. She stepped closer, just close enough for Thomas to see her clearly, then held up her stuffed rabbit as if offering him a tiny gift of appreciation. She wasn't giving it away, she was simply showing it, reminding him of the moment they shared. With the slightest movement allowed, Thomas lowered his head a fraction in acknowledgement, a quiet gesture only she would notice. Her face broke into a warm, pure smile. Her mother placed a hand on her shoulder and whispered something, prompting the girl to wave gently at him. Thomas didn't wave back, but his heart lifted quietly, full of warmth. Moments like that didn't need words or grand gestures. They lived quietly in the heart. After the girl and her family left, Thomas returned to his steady stillness. But now, that stillness felt richer. It held meaning. It held memory. When his shift ended, he walked inside the palace halls where the atmosphere was calm and respectful. A senior officer invited him into a private office where a small group of palace supervisors waited. Their expressions were warm and kind, nothing formal or intimidating. One supervisor said, "Thomas, we want to commend you. You handled the situation with great care, dignity, and calmness. You protected the image of the palace while helping someone in need. That is true professionalism." Another added, "You reminded us all that kindness and duty can exist together." Thomas listened quietly, grateful but modest. "I only did what I felt was right," he said softly. "That," the supervisor replied, "is what makes it so special." They presented him with a simple letter of appreciation, signed by several officials. It wasn't flashy or grand, it was sincere. And to Thomas, sincerity meant more than anything else. After he left the meeting, Thomas walked slowly back through the palace corridors. The walls were lined with history, paintings, portraits, decorative pieces that had been there for generations. For the first time, Thomas felt strangely connected to that history. Not because he had done something heroic, but because he had added a quiet moment of humanity to a place known mostly for ceremony. When he stepped outside into the gentle evening light, he paused for a moment before heading home. The sun was setting, washing the sky in soft shades of gold and pink. It was peaceful, calm, the kind of evening that felt like a soft sigh after a long day. As he walked home, children played in nearby parks, people walked their dogs, friends laughed together, and families shared dinner through open windows. The world felt warm, kind, connected. Thomas realized that his small act had touched more hearts than he ever imagined. But more importantly, it reminded him and others that even in structured, serious roles, humans still held gentleness inside them. When he reached his home, he took off his uniform carefully and placed it on its hanger with respect. It wasn't just clothing to him, it represented tradition, duty, and now, a memory that would stay with him forever. Before going to sleep, Thomas sat quietly by his window and reflected on everything that had happened. He thought about the girl, about her stuffed rabbit, about the crowd, about the whispers, about the messages sent to the palace. He thought about how one small, simple act could ripple across the world, touching hearts he would never meet. And he realized something important. Kindness didn't have to be big to be meaningful. It didn't need to be loud or dramatic. It only needed to be genuine. He didn't need fame. He didn't need praise. What he needed, what he valued most, was the knowledge that he had made someone feel safe, someone feel seen, someone feel cared for. And that was enough. That night, with the moonlight resting gently on his window, Thomas closed his eyes peacefully. The world would move on, new days would come, and life would return to its quiet rhythm. But somewhere in the heart of the city, people would remember the guard who chose kindness. And somewhere, in a little pink dress, a young girl would always remember the tall guard who helped her feel safe on a day when she felt lost.